Dave, I got a joke for you. Well, it's not really a joke, but I'm gonna pose it as a joke.
Okay.
What do you call someone who loves central planning, loves big socialist government, and hates Jews?
German Nazi in the 20s and 30s?
Yes, or a congressional Democrat today.
It's sad how true that is.
It is astounding to me. I've been watching these Democrats in Congress, especially Congress, and here, I don't give Joe Biden credit for many things, but I'm going to give him credit for this. In the past, I don't know what he's going to do in the future, but in the past, he's at least presented himself in speech as a friend and an ally of Israel. I don't know of any instance where he came out, railing against Israel. If he's done that, I don't know of it. But there are growing numbers of Democrats in Congress who just say the most dreadful, awful things about just describing Israel as an apartheid state, right, and accusing them of genocide. I mean, just absolute ridiculous things.
I still wonder, though, to an extent, is this one of those circumstances where actions speak louder than words? Because as much as Joe Biden is maybe saying the right things about Israel publicly, his actions certainly aren't.
Yeah, you're right.
He's withholding. We talk a lot about some of the myths you like to dispel about the American founding. Maybe I can do one or two quickly about Israel. I know we weren't planning on this, but there's a perception out there. There was a joke floating around that was a Babylon Bee article. And everybody kept sending it to me thinking I would think it was really funny. And I'm sitting there thinking, yeah, this is a little bit of misinformation on our side and not a good look for the Israelis when it's not true.
Right.
And that was that Israel is completely cared for by America, that Israel's getting billions. I think our budget shows $4 billion in aid to Israel every year.
Right. It's
not like America is cutting Israel a check for $4 billion and getting nothing in return for it.
Right.
And so that's one of those myths. It's interesting to go back and actually you pointed this out to me. We had this conversation a few weeks ago that what the New York Times dubbed Star Wars under Reagan in the 80s, that was a joint effort between the Israelis and Americans. While the Americans were creating the artillery.
I just want to be clear. That label that the New York Times came up with, Star Wars, that was meant to ridicule and mock it, to say, because Star Wars is science fiction, that this thing that Ronald Reagan wanted to do and work with the Israelis, that it was impossible. This is there's no way you cannot. To hit a missile with a missile is like trying to hit a bullet with a bullet. That was the metaphor they would always use. This is just a waste of money and time. And so that was the way of progressive journalists to mock and ridicule it.
And 30 years later, I think it's really strange for a lot of us, especially the younger members of our side of this, for younger people to really picture what the Cold War was like. Yeah. And the threats that Reagan was feeling and that Americans were feeling every day, 60s, 70s, 80s, all through the Cold War.
Yeah.
But there was a real threat of missiles being shot at the United States. I don't think we think about that quite as much today that we used to.
Mm-hmm.
But it is something that Israel saw every day. That Star Wars program was a joint effort between the Israelis and the Americans with Reagan. I don't remember off the top of my head who the Israeli prime minister was at the time. But the Israelis developed all the algorithms. They did all the computer science and all of the algorithms behind that program. They developed microchips. In fact, it got so advanced over there, Intel's 3 largest microchip processing manufacturing centers are in Israel. Intel's not making microchips in China. They're not making them in Thailand. They're not making them in Korea. They're making them in Israel. And I think something like 2/3 of the world's microchips, everybody's phone, everybody's computer, all of these devices that we all have that all have Intel chips, they're all being manufactured in Israel.
Right.
So there is $4 billion going to the Israelis out of our budget. There are microchips, there are algorithms, there are services, much of, as I understand it, much of the American military's GPS systems and all of those tracking and algorithms and radar and everything they use is all developed out of Israel.
Yep.
So it's not quite plus the intelligence services.
Well, I was to say, plus Israel is providing a beacon of moral light and a semblance of self-government. And I say that because progressivism has crept into Israel too. They're dealing really with the same kinds of problems we are, but compared to what's in that region, right? You can live in Israel, you can be a citizen in Israel, and you can practice whatever religion you want or not practice a religion at all. Right. You can vote, you can participate, you can live freely, more or less, as opposed to the tyrannical regimes around that literally do things like cut the heads off of people who are homosexual and things like that.
Well, that's the other big point in all this, right? What do people think congressional Democrats really believe? Are they really out there thinking that these congressional Democrats really care about gay rights, LGBTQ plus rights? Do they really think they believe in women's rights, in blacks and Hispanics and all of these things? How do you believe that when you see them doing things like supporting the Arabs in Gaza? And I don't like referring to them as Palestinians because there's no such thing as a Palestinian.
I actually agree with you.
Palestinian was a made-up term by Yasser Arafat in the late 60s, early 70s for political purposes.
It has an ancient, that word, I'll throw this in, that word does have some ancient meanings and ancient references. And it always referred to a region, an area. And very often it had other words connected to it.
Sure.
It was a province of the Roman Empire. In the same way, I sort of compare that the word Palestine is similar to the old word, the Orient. The Orient meant the eastern part of the world, right, as opposed to the West. That's sort of what Palestine was. It was a region, an area, but there was never a nation.
And not to go too far down this tangent, but there's no pa sound in the Arabic language. They have no way of actually saying Palestine. And if you go back and you do the research and you look at the flag of British Mandatory Palestine when it was a British colony before 1948, you go back and look at the flag in like 1939, it's half blue, half white with a big gold Star of David in the middle of it. I mean, even the British recognized it as a land of Jews. It was just they didn't want to call it Israel because it was their property. They owned it. When Israel, this is something interesting for our listeners, just real quick. When Israel was formed, much of it was purchased from the British. It wasn't like a war. They didn't go to war to go gain access to Israel. They bought the land back from the British. And a lot of the money was raised by Golda Meir, who was the third prime minister of Israel, one of the first, if not the first woman prime minister in the history of the world. And she grew up in Denver. She was born in Minneapolis. She grew up in Denver. She went to East High School, right down the street from where we're recording right now. I mean, it's just fascinating that this whole thing happened. But back to where you were talking about, how do you believe that these Democrats in Congress can actually support all of these supposed minority rights and all these rights that they claim to, when then they'll say, but Israel, who has one of the largest gay pride parades in the world, is the occupier, and the Arabs in Gaza who will behead you for being gay, who will behead you for being Christian, who will walk you out and hang you in the middle of the street for being anything other than a devout, Sharia observant Muslim.
Man, it's a great point you're making, and I'm going to ask our listeners here to just imagine that. Suppose that Hamas and the Arab Muslims living in Gaza and other areas, suppose they got what they wanted. What they want is what is sometimes referred to as a one-state solution, but what that means is no Israel. The state of Israel is gone.
And no Jews.
Jews.
There's no question
you got to get rid of the Jews, get rid of the state of Israel, and it's a Muslim, maybe it's called Palestine, maybe it's called something else, but it would be a Muslim country governed by Sharia law. Just use your imagination. Think what would happen to gay people living in that state? It would be ugly. It'd be horrific.
Forget
it'd be
just
murderous.
That state. There would be no place left in the Middle East. For them to go
suppose you wanted
and
to
be
flee.
safe.
Suppose you wanted to. Suppose you were a gay man or woman or whatever, and you see Israel dismantled and the creation of this new Sharia state, and you think, well, this is bad for me. I want to get out of here.
You're going to go to Syria or Lebanon or Jordan or Turkey?
Where are you going to go? There's no place in that entire region to go where you're going to be safe. And this is the thing I've been thinking about this. Progressives in the United States, they throw out the label of Nazi very easily. Basically, to the point that they've cheapened it. I don't know that the word has much meaning anymore because anyone who disagrees with them, anyone who raises a question, is a Nazi. If you disagree with Barack Obama, you're a Nazi. If you think we're wasting too much money on education, they call you a Nazi. And yet, if we were to make a checklist of what is actually required to be a Nazi, right? You have to believe in central planning, government central planning. You're a socialist. You believe in
the National Socialist
Party. It's the National
Socialist
Party, right. and progressives always want to. Well, they're national socialists, and they're socialists, right? They believe in socialism, and you got to hate Jews. You want to hurt Jews, and you look at that checklist to be an actual Nazi. That's a whole lot of progressive Democrats in Congress and many of their supporters and voters today.
Well, and they want to be a monolithic society. They want everybody to believe in one thing, and it's their thing and they're right, and nobody else can believe in anything else. There's no religious liberty. There's no variation in thought. And to that point, though, you said Joe Biden hasn't come out and said anything wrong about Israel.
Right.
Let's take Israel out of the equation for just a minute, and let's talk about China. He did say that the concentration camps that the Uyghurs are in that the Uyghur Muslims are in it's a cultural difference. We don't understand because it's a cultural difference.
You're right.
That's sick.
In fact, amen. You're right about that. It's interesting so to your point, it has to be monolithic. That's precisely why many progressives throw out that label Nazi or racist, because they think it will just shut down and shut up any opposition. You either agree with progressives or you're going to get called a racist or a Nazi, and you're supposed to shut up. And except for guys like us, we don't shut up even after we've been called racists and Nazis and all kinds of things.
If I haven't been called a racist this week, I didn't work hard enough.
That's right. And then you have this strange phenomenon. Millions of ordinary progressive Democrats. They when they think about themselves, they think, well, I'm a very tolerant person. I'm very open to LGBTQ and gay rights and all these kinds of social issues. And yet the party that they're part of supports organizations like Hamas, either actively supports or just turns a blind eye to places like China, one of the worst abusers of human rights. I'm not going to get us sidetracked here. I'll just throw this out. It's in the news where the laboratory in Wuhan, China, when the whole COVID thing first broke out, right there was good reason. There was good reason to think maybe this virus came from that laboratory. I mean, it is. We know this. Here's something we know. Within the pool of coronaviruses are these viruses that come from bats.
Right.
And that laboratory in Wuhan, China is one of the rare, exclusive, high-end, super high-tech laboratories that does research on viruses that come from bats.
Right.
So it's reasonable, right, when you have this virus outbreak in a city where there's a laboratory that does research on viruses that come from bats, thinking, damn, maybe the virus came from the lab. And progressives they shut that down. There's no way. No, the science shows that the virus could not have come from that laboratory. That's crazy. You're a nutty conspiracy theorist. You're stupid. You're ignorant, right? If you even suggest that. And here we are a year and a half later, and stories are coming out. It turns out employees from that laboratory were going to the hospital with COVID symptoms back in late 2019 which means, the virus must have been, escaping from the lab. And the bigger point is this: progressives who pride themselves on being tolerant and accepting are a part of a party that supports these miserable, tyrannical, unjust, controlling, closed societies and groups like China, like Hamas, like Iran. And it makes you wonder, what do progressives think go on in these other nations and these other groups?
And I want to know, the progressive members of Congress know very well what's going on. I mean, Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib have talked about wanting to implement Sharia law in their cities in Minnesota and Michigan. So they know very well what's going on. But is it just the voters are just intentionally ignoring or not wanting to know what's happening? Are they ostriches just burying their heads in the sand? I mean, how in the world can they not know this stuff?
I think part, and this is hypothesis here. I don't know this for certain, but just based on observations, I think a big part of it is there's a media that is talking 24 hours a day now, and the media focuses on things like Donald Trump. Donald Trump is so terrible. He's so horrible. He's a racist. He's a Nazi, right? Using all those terms. Bad, 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 right? Trump is bad. Trump is bad. Trump is bad all day, every day. And so things like what we're talking about here, wow, the Democratic Party is supporting Hamas and seems to be cozying up with China and things like that. It just doesn't get up to the level of being an action item, because what they're hearing every day, all day long, is the biggest threat to you right now is Donald Trump. He's horrible.
Yeah. He's been out of office for
even now today, right?
Days, and it's still about Donald Trump.
On any given day, flip on MSNBC, and chances are really high they're going to be talking about Donald Trump, even though he's a private citizen who has zero, power in government
and has zero ability to talk to the public anymore because they've kicked him off of every social media site.
That's right.
The whole thing is just, it is beyond frustrating to me. And I look around the Jewish community and I talk to friends and family, and it's just amazing to me. Friends and family who have intense connections to the Holocaust.
Right.
And they refuse to see what's really going on.
Well, here's the bottom line. American progressive Democrats who think like Nazis, act like Nazis, ought not be accusing other people of being Nazis. Because we who care about liberty, we liberty folks, we members of the Vino Veritas Society, we are the opposite. We are literally the polar opposite of Nazism.
Right.
We don't believe in central planning. We're not socialists. We don't want to control. We're not hating on a bunch of Jews and want to hurt them. And we actually care about individual liberty and private property, and we want everyone to flourish and be free.
Yep.
Let's talk about something better. Let's talk about baseball.
Well, we talked about baseball last week a little bit to start, and we got a follow-up from one of our chapter presidents, and she posed an interesting question based on, we were talking about constitutional morality last week.
Yeah.
And we were talking about this idea of being devoted to the Constitution and the ideas and the natural truths. And she posed the question, should Pete Rose be in the Hall of Fame?
Well, there's a thorny subject, Dave. Right. I got to tell you, baseball's on my mind a lot right now. My middle child, my son, who just graduated from high school, his high school baseball team is headed to the state tournament. So that's kind of an exciting thing, and I'm hoping to be there at the end of the week to see some of those games.
We all went to a ball game. You and your son and I.
Right.
We all went to a ball game.
Yeah.
This was probably 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Give or take.
He's like half a foot taller.
That was the first time I met him. And I'm sitting looking at his graduation pictures. I'm thinking his hair's gotten all big. He's about a foot taller than he used to be.
Yeah. He's about a foot taller than me.
Yeah. It's amazing how much he's grown up.
Yep.
I'll be excited for him to come back to Colorado.
So Pete Rose, what should we do with Pete?
It's
Give us a background.
Right.
Was Pete a good player?
Pete was arguably one of the best contact hitters in the history of baseball.
He holds the record for most hits, over 4,000 hits in his career. And here's another point about Pete Rose. That was over a 24-year career, and that number alone is impressive. Think about that. Playing a professional sport at the highest competitive level, Major League Baseball, for 24 years.
In an era before supplements and training at certain levels and steroid use.
Yeah, good point.
I mean, you think about these guys who use steroids to elongate their career.
Right.
That was all pre-Pete Rose's era.
Yep.
And the guy along with Ty Cobb, another controversial guy in the history of baseball, might have been the two best Talk hand-eye coordination. Maybe put Barry Bonds in that conversation too.
Yep.
But hand-eye coordination, he could put the bat on the ball as well as anybody.
For our baseball aficionados in the audience, everyone should know what it means to hit 300 or better. It sounds low if you don't understand baseball, but if you do understand baseball, you realize that's a big deal to hit 300 or better. And it's hard to hit 300 or better for a few weeks or for a few months or for a season. Pete Rose hit over 300 lifetime average. I think it was 307. So definitely over 300, over a 24-year career.
Right.
Think of what that means.
And players today, you talked about over 4,000 hits.
Yeah.
Today, most players don't get 3,000 hits.
Right.
So, I mean, he did some spectacular things on the field. He was also a great base runner. Was one of the early guys who you were talking about, the 30-30 clubs, who could hit 30 home runs and steal 30 bases in a season.
Yep.
And the guys who all did it later were all using steroids, right? I mean, Jose Canseco became notorious for that.
Yeah.
And he was the biggest steroid user maybe in the history of the game.
Yeah.
So the Pete Rose controversy is, well, there's two controversies. The first one that most people know about is he was betting on baseball, not when he was a player, but when he was later became the manager of the Cincinnati Reds.
And here's a key piece of this. To the best of our knowledge, what is known publicly, did he ever bet against his team? No. Meaning, was he throwing, purposefully losing games?
Pete Rose was arguably the most competitive person ever to play in baseball.
Right.
He hated to lose more than anybody you've ever met. I mean, there are stories about him going back off the field that he would bet on anything. Okay. This guy just wasn't betting on baseball. He would bet on who could tie their shoes the fastest.
You know that reminds me of someone also top level athlete, had that same kind of spirit. Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan liked to bet, even just on silly, right? If he was out for a little round of putt-putt golf with his friends, he wanted to bet $100 on it.
You know, there's always been a rumor, and we're going way down an off track, but there's always been a rumor that those years that Michael Jordan went to play baseball, that he got caught gambling on basketball. And that,
but that's not been proven.
Never been proven. It's all speculation. It's all rumor.
Yeah.
But that David Stern said, "I can't suspend you. You're too important to the game.
Yeah.
So just go find something else to do for 2 or 3 years until all this blows over."
Right.
And he comes back and he wins 3 more championships.
He also figured out that hitting a 100-mile-an-hour fastball is far more difficult than hitting a 3-pointer.
He was great at hitting the fastball. Throw him a curve and he couldn't hit a curve to save anything.
Trouble with the Curve,
which is a lot of players, right?
Yeah. By the way, that's a great movie. Have you seen Trouble with the Curve?
Clint Eastwood.
Clint Eastwood movie. He's a scout,
and his daughter's with him,
and he's going blind.
Yeah,
he's like macular degeneration. He can't see worth a darn. And his daughter's with him. Amy Adams is in it.
Yeah.
It's a for those who love baseball, Trouble with the Curve is a great movie.
Except for the really good scouts. They can just sit and listen, and the way they hear the ball hit the glove.
That's what he does, and he's hearing it. Yeah.
So back to Pete Rose, he gets accused of, and it gets proven that he was betting on himself, on his team to win as a manager, not as a player.
Right.
The other controversy is he was accused of corking his bat, and I think that goes along with that.
Is that where they drill a hole in it and they'll shove like cork material in it, right, and seal it off?
Supposedly gives a little more pop, a little more bounce.
Yeah.
Who knows what it actually does?
Right.
It's like the guys who hollow out the very end of their bat.
Right. I've never been convinced that it does all that much.
Yeah. Either way, he gets accused of this stuff. When they decide he was betting on his team, when they find proof that he was betting on his team, he receives a lifetime ban from baseball. And they decide at that moment that ban includes you can't go into the Hall of Fame. It's a ban from the Hall of Fame. Now betting on sports, betting on baseball was always a no-no, right? It was always forbidden. It's a little ironic today that you can't go to a ballpark in any sport without seeing a sports betting app advertisements everywhere you look. Right. Actually, just found out one of them just bought Barstool Sports.
Okay.
Penn Gaming just bought Barstool Sports just so they could promote, so they could have this $500 million, $400 million, something crazy for Barstool. So you see these apps everywhere. But Pete Rose at the time, So they said, yep, you can't go in the Hall of Fame.
And so I want to just clarify here. You can't, according to Major League Baseball, the organization, you can't bet if you're part of Major League Baseball. So that includes players, coaches, management, umpires, staff at the MLB corporate organization. You're not betting on games.
Grounds crew. I mean, even if you're grounds crew at the stadium,
you're not betting on games.
Yeah.
However, I believe there was no clear penalty attached that said, if you do bet, you shall forever be prohibited from the Hall of Fame.
It was just
that was the baseball commissioner.
You are banned from baseball for life. And they never defined what banned from baseball ever meant.
Now I'm going to throw in another wrinkle into this. You have Major League Baseball,
right?
The actual corporate entity, and then you have the Baseball Hall of Fame. It's a private organization. I believe it is organized as a charitable organization, which means they have their own board of trustees. They run their, as you like to say, it's a museum.
Yep.
It's a museum of famous baseball people, players, coaches, others who did something important in the game of baseball. That's really should be up to them, right? It's their museum.
Yes.
They get to decide who they want to honor in their museum.
And up to them it's a vote, right? It's not like just the board of directors sits around a table one day and says who should they have an election. And this is where it becomes political, and this is where it becomes interesting to our members. It is a political process. You have guys every year lobbying to get into the Hall of Fame. Now, in the NFL, every year they put like 5 players, 2 coaches, and 1 guy who's been eligible has to have been eligible for more than like 30 years or something like that.
Okay.
But they have a certain number that go in every single year.
Okay.
In baseball, it doesn't work that way. You have to get a minimum percentage vote. And they have years in baseball all the time where no one gets elected into the Hall of Fame.
Right.
Derek Jeter
just got in
last
year.
And got one of the highest vote totals ever. Only one person didn't vote for him.
Right.
And everybody kind of looked around. Who's the idiot who didn't
that
vote
jerk?
For, right, who didn't vote for Derek Jeter. But there's a lot of years where nobody gets in. It is very, very hard to get into the Baseball Hall of Fame.
Okay.
And to get into the Baseball Hall of Fame, it's the Baseball Writers Association gets to vote. And I found this as we were talking about this, as I was thinking about this based on the question that was posed, I think about that like our founders. Our founders talked about having an informed citizenry who should be voting for their representatives. That's why one of the reasons we say civic knowledge is one of our core virtues. Right. And one of the reasons. The other is you have to know how to use self-restraint and how to be self-assertive and how to be self-reliant. You need that civic knowledge.
They also emphasize, they told citizens, vote for constitutional statesmen. Vote for people who are loyal to, faithful to the Constitution and the Constitution's purpose of protecting individual liberty.
Right.
And at the same time, the founders were warning Americans, watch out for charlatans. In fact, they used the word. They said these demagogues will often call themselves leaders.
Right.
Beware of the leaders. They're going to come out and flatter you and tell you how good looking and smart you are while promising free food and free education and free housing. Think of Franklin Roosevelt, right? There's the leader, the charlatan. And of course, Americans forgot all the advice, the warnings that the founders gave, and they elect him 4 times.
Yeah. It's interesting because they almost gave the blueprint unintentionally, right? They almost taught these guys, you want to win an election?
Right.
Go be a leader.
Right. Go be a charlatan, a flatterer, a leader.
We talk about how a lot of that was learned in Germany in the late 1800s.
Yeah.
We've never really explored, and I don't know how much you have in your career. I don't know how much anybody has, in fact. But where did the people who were teaching in Germany in the late 1800s, who were they studying? They were studying Marx. They were studying Hegel.
Yeah.
Marx and Hegel, as I understand it, were students of the founding. They understood.
They did. Yeah.
They didn't necessarily agree with the founding,
right?
But they were students of it. They made a point to actually understand what happened in America's founding. They made a point to understand Locke, understand Adam Smith, understand Rousseau. I mean, they wanted to understand all the guys who for good or for positive or for worse.
Since you brought up all those names, I can't miss this opportunity to bring up just a fun little tangent. Karl Marx wrote a series of newspaper articles. He was in Europe during the American Civil War, and he saw to the core of the conflict with perfect clarity. He was a supporter of Lincoln. He understood all the excuses and demagoguery being put forth by the South to try to justify this terrible, institution of chattel slavery. And it's fascinating to go back and read Karl Marx, right? Knowing what his teachings led to in the modern world, he got it. He got what America. He understood what America was. He understood that the fight was. He understood Lincoln was hearkening back to the principles of the Declaration of Independence to condemn the injustice of slavery. It's really an interesting thing.
Have those ever been put into a collection, like a book?
That I don't know. I don't know if they have or not.
Well, it's just interesting to me to think. I mean, the founders really did in the Federalist Papers and in some of their early writings. They laid out a blueprint for, you want to go convince a bunch of ignorant voters,
right,
of uninformed, of voters with poor civic knowledge.
Tell them that they're smart, good looking, and you'll give them free stuff.
And FDR did all of that over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Subsidies and everything else. It goes back to MLB, the Hall of Fame Museum.
Right.
They want an informed voter base, right?
Right.
If you went out to the fans and you said, hey, baseball fans, vote for your favorite players for the Hall of Fame.
Be all over the map.
It would be, you'd get some guys who, hey, I like his beard.
Right.
His beard is so good.
Yes.
I want him in the Hall of Fame.
Yes.
But can he hit? Nah, who cares if he can't hit?
Yeah.
And so it's kind of one of those interesting
things. Or
things.
Here, let me make the analogy more relevant. There might be a player with all-star stats, lifetime stats, who has kind of orangish skin and a goofy hairdo and puts out stupid tweets. And there would be a whole lot of people say, well, you can't have him in the Hall of Fame because he tweeted a rude thing, right? In other words, they wouldn't judge the matter on the merits.
There are a couple of those guys out in the league right now who are some of the best players in baseball. One's a pitcher, one's a hitter. And neither of them would have a shot.
Right.
So baseball understands the same thing, and they say, we're going to have the baseball writers of America. They're going to be our voter base.
People who know the game, know the history of the game.
Yeah, and you have to be an actual member of the Baseball Writers Association of America.
Right.
And that's how it goes. So to answer the question about Pete Rose, should he be in the Hall of Fame? I don't know. I don't know that I can convincingly make an argument one way or another. Here's what I will argue. He should be on the ballot. It should be the writers deciding. The voter base should get to decide every single time.
Right.
I don't care if it's Barry Bonds, Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa, Jose Canseco for all of the steroid use, and you want to vote for him for that, or if it's Pete Rose for gambling, or if it's Ty Cobb for just being a jerk.
Yep. Let the Hall of Fame make their decision.
Right.
And for that matter, not only should they make their own decision, they can then present whoever's in the Hall of Fame. They can present it, describe it. They can explain why this person maybe was admitted, even though there was a controversy around it. They have that freedom to make those explanations.
And this goes back to we were just talking about slavery, and we are just talking about Lincoln. If anybody's never been, or if anybody is a baseball fan and they're ever in Kansas City, the Negro Baseball Hall of Fame is one of the most amazing places I've ever been. It was just awesome to see.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of guys in there who have never been offered a spot in Canton. They didn't play in Major League Baseball. They played in the Negro Leagues.
Right.
It's a museum. The Baseball Hall of Fame is a museum, and it should honor all of the people who made something to the game. And if there's more to the story, tell the story.
Yeah,
but
I agree.
Museums don't have to just be the good things in life, right? A museum can be – there's multiple Holocaust museums around the world. Yeah. They're not pleasant to go through, but they're important to tell the story.
Right. It's preserving something important that happened.
Yeah. Right. So I don't know if Pete Rose should be elected into the Hall of Fame and be given a Hall of Fame ring and jacket or whatever baseball does.
Right.
But his story should be there.
Yep.
And
I agree with that.
That museum should codify that and help people remember.
I agree with that 100%. And probably, I think I would encourage, not that they're listening to me, but those judges, I think I would lean in the side of, come on, as a player, this guy was a Hall of Famer.
Right.
He should be there because of what he did as a player. And if you need to put a little note somewhere saying, he got caught betting on behalf of his team as a man, put that there.
Yeah.
Yeah, just telling the story.
So, but it all speaks back to last week's conversation about morality. Mm-hmm. Where does morality come from? And how do we determine it? And our founder's idea that was really so unique and so genuine. I know it wasn't totally theirs. It was built up through philosophy over years. But this idea of natural rights and this idea that we are all equally human and we all have equal rights to our life, liberty, and property.
Well, I'll make this argument, which I've made before, and I'll make it again, and that is when you think about the United States, the American founding, as the first regime of genuine religious liberty, and I emphasize that because I want to separate it from the medieval notion of religious toleration, which meant the governing sovereign power might tolerate a dissident religious group. They might tolerate them, but they could retract their tolerance. They could expel them, punish them, do anything that they wanted. That wasn't – the United States was not formed as a regime of religious tolerance.
I laugh. I'm giggling a little bit about this because I'm thinking about that scenario and how much I've studied that, especially in regard to the Jewish people over the years.
Yeah.
I mean, how many the barbarians defeated the Romans in the mid 400s,
right?
And the Jews were no longer slaves to the barbarians, but they still didn't have property rights. They still weren't. They had no rights. They weren't people, but they just they said we don't. You're on your own. Like you can live here and you're on your own, but don't. This is our property. Like you don't mess with our property.
Right.
And I think about that and how much I used to think that was so bad, and then I look at Gaza today. Yeah. And what we were just talking about, and I'm like, toleration was almost better.
Yes. Well, and you're absolutely right, and we shouldn't dismiss it. In the history of tyranny, the history of the world is mainly a history of tyranny. Yeah. Not exclusively, but a whole lot of tyrannical injustice. And so religious tolerance was actually a step forward. It was a better way of life for some people, some groups who had been severely, punished, tormented, persecuted, just kind of being left alone, even if they weren't participating in the governance of a regime. Mm-hmm. If they could just be left alone, they were pretty happy with that. My background, I come from a group of German Catholics, if you go really far back, who left Germany and went and lived in the Volga River region of Russia, because at that time, I'm going all the way back to the 1870s, the Russians offered tolerance. They said, you want to camp out there by the river, knock yourselves out. You're not Russian citizens. You're not participating in the regime at all, but you can live out there and hunt and fish and do whatever you want to do, build a little church and practice the way you want. And then eventually they head to the United States in the 1880s and the 1890s. So religious tolerance was certainly a better way of life for many than alternatives. And even religious tolerance isn't religious liberty, right? Religious liberty is a regime that says the law, the government respects your individual natural rights because you're a human being, and you are free to worship or not worship any way that you want, as long as you're not violating the rights of anybody else. You want to stay home on Saturdays or Sundays and not worship at all? The law still protects your property, protects your liberty. You want to go worship? Go worship.
I don't want to keep bringing this back to Jewish differences. I don't want to make it this too much about that, but it's sort of, you have your wheelhouse. This is sort of one of mine. And I've always looked at the differences between France and the United States when the United States was being created, right? Late 1700s. In France, Jews were tolerated.
Yes.
Right? Going into the French, even before the French Revolution.
France was a Catholic monarchy
Right.
It had had a number of problems. It was basically a satellite of the Vatican, of Rome, because the King of France was effectively appointed by the Pope.
Right.
And they offered quite a bit of tolerance to various groups of Jews in France.
So at that time in France, Jews were getting to go to school for the first time.
Yeah.
Like they were allowed to attend schools for the first time. This is the first time that they were learning with other students, and they were intermixing. But it was still just tolerated, right? And then the French Revolution starts, and you had cycles where there were Jews fleeing France thinking, we have no idea how this is going to end up.
Right.
And we might go from being tolerated to, no, this is your fault again.
Yep.
You're out of here. Or we're going to kill you.
Well, and on a couple of scores, right? One, Jews have always historically been easily targeted, quickly targeted scapegoats.
Which we're seeing again right now.
And also, I mean, they're a religious group. There's a belief in God at the core of Judaism, and the French Revolution was openly hostile, violently hostile to any kind of concept of God. It's one of the reasons the French revolutionaries, some people don't know this, they actually started their own calendar. They made their own calendar because they didn't want all the pre-existing calendars had religious connotations.
Right.
You know, the Gregorian calendar in the Western world begins with the birth of Christ, and they wanted a completely secular, atheistic calendar.
And also at the same time, so the Jews had to be afraid of those people.
Right.
Well, you also had to be. There was still a lot of fear of the Catholic Church.
Sure.
Right. I mean, you think about what the previous 1,000 years had been.
Yes.
With the Catholic Church. You go back to Charlemagne. That was when the Jews were forced into slavery to be bankers.
Yes.
Right. You want to know? People don't understand why are so many Jews bankers? Because Charlemagne wanted to be a bank. He had all this money that he had gotten in conquest. Then he goes and joins the Roman Catholic Church.
Yep.
And the church says, okay, Charlemagne, you got to send us you're not allowed to own anything. Only the church is allowed to own anything. He says, screw that. I won this fair and square.
Right.
So he enslaves a bunch of Jews. He says, you're going to be my bankers. Because you don't have to answer to the church.
Right.
And ever since then, when we're talking 900 AD, 1000 AD, ever since then, they were terrified of the Catholic Church. But they did that. They did that for Charlemagne. Mm-hmm. The Charlemagne Empire falls apart, and they get called by the Polish priests, and they move to Poland, and they do the same thing there.
Right.
They say, you're not going to have property. We're going to tolerate you, but you can't have property. We'll make sure you're housed, though, because you're going to be our bankers. Yep. And it was just bouncing from one place to the next. You never knew what was going to happen.
Well, and that story, the story about the Jews involves a larger drama that was playing out across Europe, and that the larger drama, this is what makes the American founding, I would argue, the best regime, the best solution, because it solves this problem that nobody in Europe solved for 1,500 years. Mm-hmm. And here's the big drama. Europe had effectively become Christianized. 9% of Europeans were Christians of one kind or another. And then it becomes more complicated once you have the Protestant Reformation, because now you have multiple churches claiming to be the representation, right, of the authority of God. You have the Vatican and the Catholic Church. There are schisms within the Catholic Church. There are fights over who is actually the Pope and who's not. But then you have these emerging Protestant. You have Lutheranism and the Presbyterians and the Methodists. And all Europeans agreed, for the most part, that the ultimate authority in the world comes from God.
Right.
And this led to this whole notion of the divine right theory of kings, that if all authority resides with God, then when God authorizes someone to be the king, there is no challenging that. There's no check on that, because who are we mere mortals to question the authority of God? And it also meant then that the role of the church was instrumental because the church is basically what legitimizes a government, legitimizes a king. It's the church, the priests, the bishops, whoever the religious figures are in a church, they're the ones saying, we are the channels of the voice of God, and God has said, you, Dave, you're to be the king, right? Now, imagine that scenario. Imagine I'm the priestly class. I am channeling the will of God, and I'm making public pronouncements. We have communed with God, and God has said, Dave is to be our king. And over here is someone that doesn't belong to this church, doesn't believe in what this church believes in. That person is not merely someone with different religious views. That person, if he starts to get a bunch of followers, undermines your authority.
Becomes a threat.
Undermines your legitimacy, right?
Yeah.
Because if you get a bunch of people who aren't part of my church, and I'm the church, and I'm saying you're supposed to be the king, and all these other people say, we think that church is fraudulent. We think it's a fake. We don't think Cranawitter's actually communing with God. We think Tom and Dave made some crony deal, and that's why Tom appointed Dave king. That led to 1,500 years of horrific, bloody wars of religion, fights over, can a pope remove a king? Is the king independent from the pope? Which church has how much political authority? Churches had their own armies. Churches put armies into the field.
Right.
And a lot of Americans today, they think what the real great danger was that religion was involved, that churches were involved. No. What the real great danger was government power. These churches had the power of government, which is the monopoly on legalized force, including cops and armies and all the rest. The Americans come along during the American founding. They're aware of that whole history, tremendous students of that conflict for hundreds of years. I don't think any historians really have an accurate tally of how many millions of human beings were slaughtered in Europe in wars and individual acts of persecution.
Sure.
And that's what makes the American Revolution so wonderful. In fact, I'm going to use a word here, kind of fitting, quite miraculous. I mean, nothing like that had ever been done before. Everyone else was fighting about which church is going to appoint which king, and the Americans come along and say, no king, and moreover, the church, any church, has no government power.
Right.
The church isn't making any laws, isn't enforcing any laws. You want a church? Go ahead and build your church. Have it. It's your property. It's private property. Invite who you want to come and worship with you. But the church doesn't make law, it doesn't enforce law, and it doesn't judge when people are accused of breaking law. Those political powers are going to be delegated to a Congress, a president, and a judicial branch.
And think about how different that is from the French Revolution, right? The Americans are fighting for a revolution that says you can be any religion, you can have any church. They're all welcome here, and they're all going to be respected equally. Versus the French Revolution that started with, God put you in charge, therefore we don't believe in God anymore.
Right.
And it was we are going to say no religion.
Yep.
It was still central planning.
In fact,
it was still
it
was still this we're going to tell you now you can't believe in God. And if you do believe in God, now you're the heretic.
In philosophic terms, the French revolutionaries viewed God and they viewed religion as the great enemy to reason. That you can't have both. You have to have one or the other. In fact, they renamed the temple at Notre Dame, this big, beautiful cathedral. Yep. They renamed it the Temple of Reason. They engraved it on the Temple of Reason, right? Wow. That religion and reason are incompatible and hostile to each other. The Americans actually draw on a much more ancient tradition, and they said, well, both reason and revelation or religion raise ultimate questions about reality. What are the first principles of the world? What is the highest truth? What is the highest good? And we want both reason and religion to flourish and to be able to have an ongoing conversation. We want philosophy. We want people thinking. We want people worshiping and studying ancient religious texts. And we want there to have an ongoing conversation. And so in the American founding, the Americans said, we're not enshrining in law that reason trumps religion or religion trumps reason. We are separating them for the preservation of both.
Right.
And we're going to have laws that are reasonable to the extent they protect individual natural rights. And then you are free to go think, argue, worship, debate. And I would argue for a long time here, but before the rise of progressivism, there was this robust interaction between the claims of reason, the claims of philosophy, science, and the claims of revelation. And there was no mutual hostility. I mean, I'll give you one example that always stands out in my mind. Preachers, Christian preachers during the American Revolution would stand up in church on Sunday morning during the service, and they would quote John Locke. They would quote Adam Smith, because their view was, well, God does speak to us sometimes through special revelation. You know, think of God speaking to Moses right? On Mount Sinai. There's a direct, God's directly communicating. But God also has given us reason. And so if we use our reason and we discover a truth, that's just as legitimate. That's just as true as something that, you know, God told directly to us. And so they saw reason and revelation as in some ways compatible. Any disagreement as a healthy thing. Let's do it. Make the case, revelation. Make the case, philosophy. And let's think about this. Once progressivism comes along, in a way, and you certainly see this in places like Nazi Germany, which, like the French, was violently atheistic. I mean, hostile to the claims of religion. Right? You had to drive out God because the central planners in government had to be viewed as the highest thing, the highest authority. And so within totalitarian regimes, there's no room for a God that's above government, outside of government. And so progressivism really becomes the new official religion, and that we've seen spreading over the last 150 years. In a way, it's a defeat of this ultimate triumph we see in the founding of a regime of real religious liberty.
Well, I couldn't help but be struck as you were describing all of this, how much you're describing about France and Germany and the European countries of the 1700s, 1800s. They resemble United States leftists today.
Yeah, very much.
They resemble the left today. And it's no wonder that you have people on the left saying, well, every other country in the world does this. Why shouldn't we? Every other country in the world offers universal health care. Why shouldn't we?
Yes.
Every other country in the world has better minimum wages. Why? Because they don't work.
I would put it this way. They work for a few, for those who are in power. For everyone else, it really sucks.
Depends on what the true desired purpose is.
What works means.
Hint, hint. Go watch the case study for your June meeting.
Imagine if that attitude had been prevalent. The rest of the world does it in 1776 or 1787, right? I mean, imagine a bunch of progressive Democrats standing there around Thomas Jefferson. Well, the rest of the world has kings. Right. Why shouldn't we have a king? The rest of the world have established religion that you must belong to or you get persecuted. Why shouldn't we have it, right? We Americans stood up and said, we don't care what the rest of the world is doing. We want to do what's right. We want justice. We want what's true, not what the rest of the world has.
It's just amazing to me. I mean, we literally have come full circle. I mean, you go back to that. We have leftists in Congress today actively fighting in favor of regimes that don't believe in religious liberty, that don't believe in freedom, that don't believe in equal rights, that don't believe in welfare for all, the ability to go out and pursue your happiness, your welfare. I mean welfare in that standpoint, not welfare in the here's a check sense. We're talking about this. I'm thinking back to do you remember the movie History of the World Part 1, Mel Brooks?
Oh, vaguely.
So there's a scene in there. And I'm going to use a little bit of bad language. I hope our members don't mind. But I'm quoting the movie.
All right. Turn this down if you have kids listening.
There's a scene in the movie where a bunch of people are in the unemployment line.
Okay.
And B. Arthur. Remember B. Arthur from the Golden Girls?
Right.
B. Arthur is the is the clerk at the unemployment line, and she's coming in, and Mel Brooks comes up and she says, occupation, and he says philosopher.
Philosopher. I do remember this. Yes.
And she says, so you're a stand-up bullshitter. And he gives like this eye roll, and she says, did you bullshit today? No. Did you try to bullshit today? Yes. Are you going to try to bullshit tomorrow? Yes. But like, it was a joke for so long. Like, we could joke about these things. We could make fun of the idea that like that's what cultures were in Europe, and that's what people were looking at. They looked to the government to take care of them. They looked to the kings.
Yep.
We can't take care of ourselves. We don't know how to make the best decision. We're afraid of God. We're afraid of what's right and what's wrong. Nobody is sitting there at any point saying, I want to make what the best decision is for me. I want to make decisions for myself. I want to be self-reliant. I want to be self-assertive. I want to be self-restrained.
I would put it this way. We went from being a regime of religious liberty to a progressive regime of an established religion, an official religion, and the new religion is progressivism.
Right.
It really is organized like a religion. It has its high priests. You know, think of the hotshots in the critical race theory, the most prominent of the political class. They are the high priests and priestesses, and there are the devout followers. And anyone who disagrees, they're not viewed as, there's someone who has a different opinion or is making a different argument. They're viewed as heretics. You're a heretic. I'm going to label you something bad, and we need to shut you up and shut you down any way possible.
Yeah. And it's amazing how we had these ideas at our founding that were just so simple, and they were so beautiful, and they were so freeing. And I just sit there and I think, you know, you're trying to make yourselves out. These people on the left, you're right. They're trying to make themselves out to be gods, to be prophets. I wonder if
they're not.
I wonder if Moses ever served bar like AOC. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what they're doing. They're just trying to gain power. And at one point, this goes back to last week's podcast, and I think this is the place we leave this. But at one point, we as Americans have to stand up and say, wait a minute, this isn't going to work anymore. This is not. And in order to do that, we can't keep fighting over, well, you're not Catholic enough, or you're not Jewish enough, or you're not this enough, or you're not. It doesn't matter. Those things are not what applies to who you vote for, who your representatives are. Your representatives, we talked about this last week, your representatives don't have to look like you. They don't have to be like you. They just have to be good freedom thinkers. They have to understand what the freedom of the United States was founded on, and how to maintain it, and how to go fight for it.
Be good constitutionalists.
Right.
And the fact is, liberty is good for most people, but there is one class it's not good for: power mongers. People who want power and control over others. Liberty is not good for them. They can't get what they want. So those, the progressive political class who is out there, they're out there encouraging Americans to give up their liberty. And in all kinds of really seductive, right? They have some clever marketing schemes, reasons why we should give up our liberty. But there's a reason they're doing that. There's a reason they want to increase government control over our lives, because that gives them power over our lives. And that's a scary thing.
And there's a lot of that we just talked about that can tie in really nicely to this month's case study. So I really hope if you're listening, make sure the other members of your chapter, this podcast in particular, make sure that they listen to this, because there's a lot of application between this podcast and the case study this month. And when you think about what is the intent of these government programs, what actually gets done.
Well, let me summarize it this way. Why does government keep proposing so many programs that don't work? And the answer is, doesn't matter if they work or not. What matters is it increases their control over our lives and our property.
Right, and we'll just keep fighting against it.
Yep, that's why we're guardians of the American idea.
Nos somos custodios.